My own son and his wife smiled in my face while tricking me into signing a document that gave them control of everything I owned. They thought I was just a confused, obsolete old woman who wouldn't notice a thing. But I found out they were secretly draining my grandchildren's entire college fund, $250,000, just to maintain their lavish lifestyle and hide a desperate secret from their wealthy friends. They forgot one thing, though. A quiet librarian knows how to find everything. And I used that knowledge to deliver the most satisfying public justice you could ever imagine. The air in my son David's house always felt thin, like it was filtered to remove any trace of real life. That Sunday was no different. The whole place smelled of roasted asparagus and a kind of cheerful desperation. I was perched on one of those hard, minimalist bar stools in their kitchen, the kind designed for looks, not for sitting, a glass of expensive white wine sweating next to my hand. This was our weekly dinner, a ritual that had started to feel less like a family meal and more like a polite interrogation. My daughter-in-law, Brenda, was the lead prosecutor. She moved around her vast marble island with a brittle energy, her smile never quite softening the worry in her eyes. She told me I was being too quiet and wondered aloud if the wine was too much for me. She sent David, my son, to fetch me a glass of water as if I were a wilting houseplant. David, who had become his wife's shadow, immediately jumped to it, placing the heavy glass in front of me with an exaggerated care that set my teeth on edge. This was their new thing, this smothering concern. Over the last few months, they had decided everything was suddenly too much for me. Phone calls from my old friends at the library were too stressful. A trip to the grocery store was a potential hazard. Brenda had even taken to sorting my mail, a helpful service I never asked for. They were building a gilded cage around me, and I was starting to realize it wasn't to protect me from the world, but to protect themselves from me. The real reason for the evening's performance arrived with dessert, a dense chocolate cake that tasted like obligation. Brenda slid a sheaf of papers across the cold countertop. She said it was just a little something to make my life easier, her voice dropping into that low, sincere tone she used when she was selling something. She explained they were just some simple estate planning forms, something to give David permission to handle my online accounts so I wouldn't have to bother with all those confusing passwords. A new security protocol, she called it. David nodded along, adding that it was really for my own protection, what with all the scams targeting seniors these days. I picked up the papers. My hands were steady. For 40 years, I'd managed acquisitions for the county library system. I've read contracts that could make a lawyer weep. My eyes trained to find the devil in the details, scanned the dense paragraphs, and found him nestled in Section 3, Durable Power of Attorney. It wasn't about passwords. It was a complete surrender of my financial independence. A cold knot formed in my stomach, tight and heavy. But I knew in that moment that to fight them now would be to lose the war before it had even begun. They saw a frail, confused old woman. I needed them to keep seeing her. So I picked up the expensive pen they offered and signed my name with the clean, steady script of a docile mother who trusted her children completely. Later, as I was in the guest room pulling on my coat, I heard their voices coming from David's home office. The door was cracked just enough for his harsh, panicked whisper to slice through the silence. He was telling her it wasn't enough that the next capital call was in 10 days. 10 days. He said if they didn't meet it, they would lose everything, and people would start asking where the initial investment came from. There was a pause, and then I heard Brenda's voice, sharp and thin as a shard of glass. She told him to sell the boat, and for God's sake, to keep his voice down, his mother was still in the house. I froze my hand on the doorknob. Capital call, investment, 10 days. The words were just fragments, but my mind, the mind of a research librarian, began to assemble them. I didn't have the whole story, but I had the table of contents, and it was terrifying. I slipped out the front door without another word, the cold Connecticut air hitting my face like a slap. The cage was locked, and now I knew it had a ticking clock. By the way, if you're enjoying the story so far, please consider subscribing so you don't miss what's next. We'd also love to hear your own story if you'd like to share it with our community. Now let's get back to it. For 2 full days, I did nothing. I let the silence in my little house settle around me. When David called to check in, I answered in short, placid sentences. When Brenda arranged for a grocery delivery because going to the store was too much of a risk, I thanked her politely. I was performing the role they had written for me, the fading matriarch, a woman happily becoming obsolete. But while my hands were busy with my knitting, my mind was running. They had forgotten that for 40 years my job wasn't just stamping books. I was a research specialist. I hunted down facts, connected disparate pieces of information, and saw the patterns others missed. They saw a quiet old woman in a house full of books. They'd forgotten I was the one who built the catalog. My first move when I made it on Wednesday afternoon was designed to be a pebble tossed into a still pond. I wanted to see the ripples. I called Brenda, making sure to put a slight tremble in my voice, the kind of manufactured confusion I'd heard her use on me so many times. I told her I was so sorry to bother her, but I'd been looking at the statement for the Grandchildren's Trust Fund, the one my late husband had set up. I explained that I seemed to have misplaced the last few pages and was hoping to see how the T. Rowe Price Fund was doing, adding that my husband had always been so proud of that particular investment. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. I could almost hear the gears in Brenda's mind grinding to a halt. T. Rowe Price. It was a specific, concrete detail, a fact buried in years of paperwork that a clueless old woman wasn't supposed to remember. Her voice, when it came back, was an octave too high. She told me David had moved the money into a different portfolio, something with a much better return. When I asked with innocent curiosity what it was called, she fumbled, finally landing on the idea that it was an exclusive private equity fund with no public name. The lie was as flimsy as a soap bubble. An hour later, my son called, his voice booming with a confidence he clearly didn't feel. He said Brenda told him I'd asked about the trust. He had a different story. He'd put it in a high-yield real estate venture, and the returns were incredible. He was going to surprise us all at Christmas. A different lie. They were sloppy. They were guilty, and they were clumsy. That evening, I made a second call. This one was to Arthur Pims, a retired probate lawyer who used to play chess with my husband every Thursday. I didn't tell him everything. I just said I had some concerns about financial documents I'd recently signed and that my children were being evasive. Arthur's voice, usually a dry rustle of old papers, immediately sharpened. He told me to send him a copy of what I'd signed using the secure messaging app he'd insisted I install last year, and then he told me not to sign anything else. I finally had an ally. My first move in building a new network. The backlash came the very next day. Brenda showed up at my door unannounced, her face stretched into a mask of cheerfulness. She announced that they were having my landline disconnected because it was a security risk. From now on, she said I would use the lovely new smartphone they had bought me, holding up a sleek, impenetrable black box. All the important numbers, she assured me, were already programmed in. It wasn't a gift. It was a digital leash. They were trying to cut me off from the outside world, from anyone like Arthur. They felt exposed. My single, innocent question had them in a full-blown panic. I had rattled their cage, and now the keepers were terrified. I accepted the smartphone with a sigh of practiced resignation. I made a whole show of it, telling Brenda how dear all this new technology was, and that I wasn't sure my old brain could ever figure it out. She spent a full hour patiently teaching me how to use the contacts she had pre-programmed. her shoulders visibly relaxing as I fumbled with the screen. She was soothed by my incompetence. It was exactly what I wanted. For the next week, I was the model of compliance. I stayed home. I read my books. When David's name would flash on the screen for his daily check-in, I'd answer and speak only of the weather or the new buds on my rose bushes. I could feel the tension draining from their voices with each passing day. They believed the brief storm had passed, that my questions about the trust had been a momentary flicker of old age confusion. They thought they were back in control. Of course, at the time, I didn't know the whole ugly story, but my research, the work I was doing in secret, eventually painted a very clear, very pathetic picture for me. I can see it all now. I see them 6 months earlier at some exclusive charity auction in a grand ballroom feeling out of their depth. Then a man named Marcus Thorne enters their lives, a man with a dazzling smile and a vocabulary stolen from a financial dictionary. He would have spoken to them about off-market opportunities and invitation-only tranches, selling a dream of effortless wealth that would finally put them on par with the old money families they so desperately wanted to impress. Terrified of being left behind in the silent, vicious social competition of their world, they bought it. They took the entire $250,000 from their own children's future, a simple, secure fund my husband had built with blue-chip stocks and steady bonds, and wired it all to a company with a fancy, meaningless name. And now Marcus Thorne's phone went straight to voicemail. The investor website was always down for maintenance. They weren't just thieves, they were fools. And they were trapped in a web of their own making. While they were living in that state of quiet, screaming panic, I was in my sanctuary. The smartphone was a leash, but they had forgotten I could leave the house. Every other morning, I took the bus to the local public library, my old domain. I'd find a computer terminal tucked away in the back one with a privacy screen, and I would get to work. It all came back to me so easily. The search terms, the public databases, the scent of information waiting to be found. I methodically untangled their lies. The high-yield real estate venture David had boasted about was a shell corporation registered to a P.O. box with no listed assets. The private equity fund Brenda mentioned was a ghost. It didn't exist. Using the secure app on my personal tablet, not their phone, I sent a steady stream of meticulously documented findings to Arthur. I wasn't resting. I was gathering my ammunition. Their arrogance, it turned out, was my greatest weapon. As their fear of me subsided, their carelessness grew. One evening, David stopped by for a brief check-in. He was so full of confidence, so sure he had me safely tucked away in my cage, that he left his briefcase sitting in my entryway. While he was in my kitchen making a big show of checking the expiration date on my carton of milk, I moved. My grandson, a wonderful boy who works in cybersecurity, had given me a gift a few years back, a tiny USB drive he called a keylogger. I slipped it from the desk drawer and slid it into an open port on the side of David's laptop inside his briefcase. It was a long shot, a gamble. But I was beginning to understand my children. Their carelessness was growing in direct proportion to their belief that they had already won. The little USB drive my grandson had given me was more fruitful than I could have ever hoped. It took less than a day for it to capture everything I needed: passwords, account numbers, and most importantly, panicked text messages between David, Brenda, and a whole group of other so-called investors. I now had a complete picture of their desperation. Armed with this, Arthur Pims knew exactly what to do. The first tremor of the earthquake I was planning began not with a shout, but with the quiet authority of a registered letter. It was delivered on a Tuesday, and I knew it would bypass Brenda's helpful mail sorting. It was from the office of Arthur Pims, Esquire, printed on heavy, cream-colored bond paper the kind that signals expensive trouble. The letter was addressed directly to David. Arthur had crafted a masterpiece of understated menace. It was a simple, formal inquiry, just a single paragraph, requesting a complete accounting of all assets held in the trust for my grandchildren pursuant to his fiduciary duties as an officer of the court. He even cited the relevant Connecticut state statutes. It was polite professional, and I knew for them it would be utterly terrifying. That afternoon, as if on cue, they showed up at my house, their faces tight with a forced casualness that was almost comical. They were there to check on me, of course, but really, they were there to see if I knew anything. I was in the living room pretending to doze over a book when David's phone rang. I watched him through my eyelashes. I saw his posture straighten, his face drain of color. His voice was a strained whisper at first, but it quickly rose in pitch. I heard him ask his lawyer what he meant by a formal inquiry. He asked who it was from. There was a long pause, and then he practically shouted the name, "Pims! Who the hell is Arthur Pims?" I could hear the tinny squawk of the lawyer on the other end of the line. Another pause, this one filled with a dawning, sickening horror. I heard David's voice drop, filled with disbelief, as he repeated what he'd been told. He was my father's old chess partner. You've got to be kidding me. The carefully constructed walls of their world were beginning to crack. Their own lawyer, a man whose entire career was built on managing the pristine images of wealthy clients, sounded deeply unimpressed with their amateurish fraud. The full-scale earthquake hit that evening. When they tried to leave, I insisted they stay for dinner. I told them I had a pot roast in the oven, the kind I used to make for David when he was a boy. A meal that spoke of home and safety, and a time before all this ugliness. It was a deliberate act of psychological warfare, and they were too flustered to refuse. We sat at my old dining room table, the silence punctuated only by the clinking of silverware. Then midway through the meal, Brenda's phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at it, and her face went completely ashen. A moment later, David's phone buzzed too. I knew what it was. The investor group chat, the one I now had full access to, was exploding. Arthur, using the information I had given him, had filed a formal complaint with the SEC on behalf of an anonymous client. The news was out. Marcus Thorne's assets had been frozen. It was over. It was Brenda who broke first. A choked, guttural sob escaped her lips. She whispered that it was all gone, that everything was gone. Her eyes locked on the screen of her phone. David slammed his fork down the sound, cracking the tense silence like a gunshot. His eyes, wild with rage and fear, found mine. He shouted at me that I had done this, that the letter from my lawyer friend had triggered it all. He yelled that I couldn't just leave it alone. My voice, when I answered, was quiet, calm, but it cut through his hysteria like a scalpel. I simply asked him, "Leave what alone, David?" Leave alone the fact that my grandchildren's $250,000 has vanished. That's when he finally shattered. He screamed that I didn't understand. And then the confession poured out of him, a pathetic, ugly torrent of shame and desperation. He told me everything right there at my dining room table. He spoke of the charismatic guru who promised impossible returns, of the crushing fear of being seen as a failure in their high-pressure world. He confessed to the lies they told each other, the fantasy that just one more investment would fix everything and they could put the money back before anyone noticed. Brenda sat beside him, weeping silently into her hands, her perfect, curated facade now just a pile of rubble at her feet. Their conspiracy, their united front, was broken. For the first time in months, I wasn't the victim. I wasn't the doddering old woman they needed me to be. I was the one in control. I looked at my son, this stranger, with a face I once knew so well, and my voice was devoid of malice, filled only with a profound, chilling clarity. I told him that the SEC was just the beginning. Now I said, you will tell me exactly what is left, and then you will listen to exactly what is going to happen next. The terms I laid out for David and Brenda that night were simple. There would be no negotiation. First, they would sign a document Arthur had prepared immediately revoking the power of attorney they had tricked me into signing. Second, they would provide a full written confession of their actions detailing the liquidation of the trust and the fraudulent scheme they had fallen for. And third, they would proceed with their annual fundraiser for the Fairfield County Historical Society. Canceling, I told them, would only raise questions they couldn't afford to answer. It was a statement that was both true and, I admit, a calculated act of cruelty. The stage for their public reckoning had to be their own. When I arrived at their house a week later, it was in full performance mode. Caterers bustled about a string quartet, played softly in the corner, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and quiet ambition. I wore a simple, elegant navy blue dress that I'd owned for 20 years. Amidst all the Botox and designer labels, I must have looked like a ghost from another time. David and Brenda played their parts as the perfect hosts, their faces pale and taut, with a terror only I could see. Their smiles were as brittle as spun sugar. Their guests, the absolute top tier of their social pyramid, mingled and laughed, completely oblivious to the fact that they were attending a wake. I had spent the week at my desk, not celebrating, but working. The keylogger had given me a treasure trove of incriminating data. I compiled it all into a single devastating document, a meticulous timeline of their deceit. I cross-referenced bank transfers with the frantic text messages I'd captured. I matched their lies to me with their desperate communications with Marcus Thorne. It was a complete, irrefutable narrative of their downfall. I gave it all to Arthur, who helped me draft an anonymous, richly detailed tip to the Securities and Exchange Commission's whistleblower office. We didn't just point them in the right direction, we gave them a map, a timeline, and a list of witnesses. The climax began just as the caterers were serving the main course of filet mignon that none of us at my table would ever eat. There was a quiet, firm knock at the front door. I saw David's shoulders tense. He excused himself, thinking it was a late-arriving guest. When he opened the door, he wasn't greeted by a smiling friend, but by two grim-faced individuals in dark, conservative suits. They didn't need to raise their voices. They simply identified themselves as agents from the SEC and presented him with a warrant. A hush fell over the dining room as the agents stepped inside their presence, sucking all the air out of the room. One of them, a tall woman with an impassive face, addressed David and Brenda in a clear, professional voice that carried through the entire house. She asked if they were David and Brenda Miller, and then informed them they had a warrant to seize all financial records and electronic devices in connection with an investigation into the collapse of Thorne Capital Investments. The name Thorne Capital was the bomb that detonated in the center of the party. A wave of panicked murmurs rippled through the guests. These were people whose lives were built on avoiding any hint of scandal, and now scandal was standing in their foyer. Worse, as I had discovered from the group chat logs, several of the guests in that very room were also investors in the scheme. Their social circle wasn't just witnessing a downfall, they were the collateral damage. Brenda let out a small, strangled gasp and sank into a chair, her hand flying to her mouth. David stood frozen in the doorway, his face a canvas of disbelief and utter public ruin. The judgment didn't come from me. I didn't have to say a word. It was in the cold, official process of the federal agents methodically beginning their work. It was in the horrified, accusatory stares from their friends and neighbors, people who were now realizing their own money was gone. It was in the dawning, sickening realization on every face in the room that the Millers' perfect life was a complete and catastrophic fraud. I remained seated at my table, calmly taking a sip of water. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't made a scene. I had simply organized the truth and delivered it to an entity far more powerful than I was. The system was now delivering the consequences. It was a precise, impersonal, and devastatingly effective form of justice. My children weren't just losing their money, they were losing the one thing they truly worshipped: their reputation. The immediate aftermath of the party wasn't a loud explosion, but a slow, quiet demolition. The SEC investigation, fed by the meticulous timeline of information Arthur and I had provided, was brutally efficient. David and Brenda were not the masterminds of the Ponzi scheme the investigation concluded, but they were complicit. They had knowingly used stolen funds from a trust they administered, and they had actively recruited others in their circle. The consequences were absolute. They lost everything. The grand house, the 2 luxury cars, the boat David was so proud of, the membership at the country club, it all vanished, liquidated to pay a fraction of their legal fees and court-ordered restitution. The social fallout was just as total. Friends who had once vied for an invitation to their fundraiser now crossed the street to avoid making eye contact. They had become pariahs' ghosts, haunting the town where they had once considered themselves royalty. Under the immense weight of their ruin, their already fractured alliance crumbled completely. Their paths diverged. Brenda, I learned later, was unable to cope with the shame of it all. It wasn't the shame of what she had done, but the shame of being caught. She retreated into a bitter, resentful denial. In her version of the story, it was my fault for not letting it go, the other investor's fault for being so greedy, anyone's fault but her own. She packed her bags one afternoon and moved to live with her sister in another state. Her final words to David, I was told, were a venomous whisper about his weakness, for confessing, for breaking down, for not being strong enough to maintain the lie. David, however, surprised me. Stripped of all his pretensions, with nothing left to perform, for something that had been broken in him for a very long time began to heal. He pleaded guilty to the charges against him. He cooperated fully with the investigators, helping them build a larger case against the real architects of the scheme. In the end, he was sentenced to 5 years of probation and 1,000 hours of community service. He took a humbling job at a local garden center, spending his days unloading soil and hauling plants, the hard physical labor, a kind of penance. He started seeing a therapist, someone to help him unravel the deep-seated insecurity that had fueled his obsession with status and appearances his whole adult life. His journey toward accountability was faltering and slow, but for the first time it was real. While their world was being dismantled, I was busy reclaiming my own. Arthur had the power of attorney nullified the day after their confession, and I took firm, explicit control of all my finances. But more importantly, I reclaimed my life. I started having lunch every Tuesday with my old friends from the library, women I hadn't seen in months. I joined the local historical society, a delicious irony that was not lost on me, and found I had a real passion for archiving the town's stories. I began volunteering, teaching literacy skills to adults at the community center. My little house, which they had tried to turn into a cage, once again became my sanctuary, filled with books and friends and a quiet, authentic peace. With a portion of my own savings, I restarted the educational fund for my grandchildren. It was smaller than what their grandfather had left, but it was built on a foundation of truth, not secrets. A year passed. I was in my garden, kneeling in the soft earth, showing my 2 grandchildren how to tell the difference between rosemary and thyme by their scent. The air was warm, and they were laughing, their futures secure, not by a number in a bank account, but by the simple resilience of the woman beside them. A modest, well-used car pulled up to the curb. It was David. He didn't get out and come to the door, but waited at the end of the driveway. It was his day to see the children. He looked older and tired, but the frantic, anxious energy that had always surrounded him was gone. He met my eyes across the lawn, and for the first time in more years than I could count, there was no lie between us. He gave a small, hesitant nod. It was a gesture of respect. I nodded back a gesture of acknowledgement, not of forgiveness. Forgiveness was a currency he had not yet earned. But in that quiet, sunlit space between us, a new reality had been established. One built not on gilded cages and desperate lies, but on the hard, unforgiving ground of truth. In the end, Judith's story reminds us that true strength doesn't always roar. It can be found in the quiet rustle of a turning page and the steady, methodical pursuit of the truth. She understood the desperation that led her children to betray her, but she never confused understanding with forgiveness. Her victory wasn't about vengeance, it was about consequences. She simply organized the facts and allowed the truth, in all its unforgiving clarity, to deliver a justice more perfect than any revenge she could have imagined.